What's the scariest thing you've ever witnessed on a casual day? Story 1. Driving home from the lake house following behind a tractor trailer on the highway in the middle of nowhere, deep in the Canadian Rockies, we rounded a bend when suddenly a small car coming from the opposite direction, far too fast for the curve, lost control and hit the tractor trailer head-on at full highway speed. A huge cloud of car parts exploded into the air as the small car spun violently into the ditch. Instinctively, I jumped out and ran toward the car, shouting at another motorist to call 911. When I reached it, there was nothing left of the front. The engine was lying on the other side of the highway. I looked into what was left of the car but couldn't find the driver. Confused, I looked around and saw him in the ditch. I ran over, checked his carotid pulse, but there was nothing. I stepped back, and only then did I notice his arm was missing. His leg was missing. His other leg was twisted completely the wrong way, at the hip and bent in several horrific angles. They shut down the highway for 8 hours to investigate the crash. The image of his mangled body has never faded from my mind. Story 2. I went out to eat at a Chinese restaurant with a few friends. One of them has a severe shellfish allergy, but she always tells the staff, and we had been to that place countless times before without any issue. That day, though, we had a new server who barely spoke English, and apparently the message about her allergy, that she absolutely could not have anything that came into contact with shellfish, didn't get passed along. Even her tempura couldn't be fried in the same oil as shellfish. You can probably guess where this is going. She started eating, then suddenly began to panic and told us to call 911 because she was having an allergic reaction. I got on the phone while she pulled out her epinephrine injector and accidentally shot it straight through her thumb. Thankfully, the response time was incredibly fast, and the paramedics administered epinephrine before her throat completely closed. Aside from a painful thumb and an expensive hospital bill, she ended up being fine. But in those terrifying moments, watching her worsen after misfiring her injector, I genuinely believed I might see my best friend suffocate in front of me, completely helpless to stop it. Story 3. I was walking back to my family's car after my great-grandmother's funeral. It was a quiet, sunny afternoon, and since she had passed peacefully of old age, the mood was calm. We were about 40 yards from our car when we suddenly heard the sharp crack of wood breaking to our left. To our horror, a large dump truck had just rolled over a small tree and was barreling down a hill straight toward our cars with no one behind the wheel. 2 of my younger brothers were already running to our minivan to grab the good seats and were directly in its path. I can still hear the screams of my parents and relatives as everyone realized what was happening within seconds. Miraculously, no one was hurt. My brothers stopped in their tracks, and the truck narrowly missed our car, but completely crushed my grandfather's car behind it, along with several gravestones across the road, before finally stopping. We later found out the driver had forgotten to engage the emergency brake when parking. It remains one of the most terrifying and surreal moments of my life. Story 4. I went hiking with 3 of my friends yesterday up one of my favorite canyons here in Utah. It's really close to town, but hardly anyone goes there because the hike is tough. This time, though, as we went up the trail, we started noticing random things like shoes, coats, backpacks, shirts, and water bottles just lying in the middle of the path. At first, I brushed it off, thinking someone probably set their stuff down and went up the hill. But the farther we went, the stranger it got. We stopped to rest near a big pile of gear. There was a huge hiking bag, sleeping bag, and tent, all tucked under a rock, but no one was around. We kept going and came across another backpack with several coats thrown across the ground. The bag was completely packed to bursting. None of us dared to look inside. I honestly didn't want to know what was in there. By now, I was getting uneasy. There was too much stuff for one person. It would take 10 people to haul all that gear up this steep trail, or one person making 10 trips. And either way, it didn't make sense. Still, we pressed on and soon came across another big pile of items right in the middle of the trail. What looked like a military ammo case and several large backpacks stacked on top of other bags I couldn't identify. Something about that pile set off alarms in my head. As we rounded a bend, everything suddenly went silent. No birds, no animals, just dead quiet. My friend called out, "Hello? Is anyone there? But there was no response. Maybe I was paranoid, but I swear I could feel eyes on us. The feeling was so strong that I made the call to turn back immediately. Something strange was going on in that canyon, and I wanted no part of it. Maybe it was something innocent, but it felt wrong. I'm planning to go back another day, earlier and better prepared, maybe with some protection just in case. I've seen weird, unexplainable things in that canyon before, and this time felt no different. Story 5. A few years ago, in the very early morning hours of July 5th, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. On my way back to bed, I passed my husband in the hallway as he headed to his own bathroom, and then we both heard and felt a massive, concussive boom. The force was so strong, it made my chest feel like my heart skipped a beat. Living in a post-September 11th world, our first thought was that it might have been a bomb. Car alarms all over the neighborhood started blaring, and since it was warm, we had our windows and the sliding door open. That's when we heard a man nearby scream, "Call 911!" He sounded close, really close. It turned out that some drunk guy in our apartment complex had duct-taped a bunch of fireworks sparklers together and lit them in the middle of the street. They went off way faster than he expected. The explosion sent wire shrapnel flying everywhere, embedding into cars, trees 30 feet away, and even the pavement. The street itself looked like something out of a cartoon, with a huge black scorch mark right down the center. The guy ended up blowing off his lower leg and getting shrapnel lodged in his arm. He went into cardiac arrest in the ambulance but was resuscitated. I never heard if he faced charges, but the apartment manager later confirmed he permanently lost his lower leg and almost lost his arm as well. Story 6. My friend and I got lost in downtown Kansas City while on our way to a concert. We pulled over to check the directions, and across the street, there was a steep hill with a sidewalk running down it. Suddenly, I saw a little girl in a toy car rolling down the hill, straight toward oncoming traffic. A man, presumably her father, was right behind her, but didn't notice immediately. Within seconds, the girl was flying down the hill, and her father was sprinting after her. My friend and I froze, horrified, watching it unfold. The road at the bottom of the hill was full of moving cars. Then out of nowhere, the father launched himself into the air like a superhero and caught the handle of the toy car just before it reached the street. It was absolutely terrifying and incredible all at once. He didn't think twice about his own safety. He just dove without hesitation to save his daughter. Story 7. I was visiting New York City with a friend, and we were trying to rent bikes, but every one of them was already taken. There was a couple nearby who were flying back to Europe the next day and desperately wanted to take one last bike ride together, but they only had one bike. I gave them the one I was about to rent, and they were so grateful. The joy on their faces made my whole day. My friend and I walked about a quarter of a mile to another bike rack, rented 2 bikes, and started riding down the path. A few minutes later, we heard sirens and saw a crowd gathering near a garbage truck just 10 feet away from the path. As we got closer, we saw a trail of blood and someone on the ground convulsing violently. It turned out that the brakes on one of the rental bikes had failed, and the rider had been struck by the garbage truck. To my horror, the man standing nearby screaming was the same person I had given my bike to earlier, and the person on the ground was his wife. The woman whose smile had made me happy just moments ago was lying there mortally injured. It was clear from the scene that she wasn't going to survive. I couldn't stop thinking about it afterward. The realization that the bike I had given away was the one with faulty brakes. My act of kindness had unintentionally caused that tragedy. For a long time, I couldn't help but wonder, if I hadn't given away my bike, would I have been the one under that truck instead? Story 8. I grew up in a tiny rural community, so small that the entire county had only one stoplight, and 3/4 of the streets in the county seat were one way. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. On this particular day, I was in middle school, riding the bus as we looped around town to pick up the elementary school kids. As we inched toward the only stoplight, the bus stopped at a small cross street lined with the town's 3 bars. I glanced out the window to my left just in time to see one of my classmates' fathers raise a double-barreled shotgun and shoot another man in the face from about 4 feet away. The man had been standing on the sidewalk in front of a small restaurant, and his head nearly exploded against the white wall behind him. I'll never forget the sight of blood and pieces of skull dripping down that wall on what had been a sunny fall afternoon. After firing, my classmate's dad calmly sat down on the curb beside the gun, lit a cigarette, and waited for the police to arrive. I was the only one who actually saw him pull the trigger. Everyone else on the bus turned only after they heard the blast. The driver called it in over the radio, but couldn't move the bus because of the traffic bottleneck. So about 20 middle and high school students sat there, staring at a nearly headless body for 15 minutes until emergency crews finally cleared the scene and let us move on. Story 9. I watched an old warbird fighter jet crash into a restaurant and explode in flames during an air show. I was very young, so I only have a few vivid mental images from that day, but the emotions tied to them have never faded. One image, the strongest, is of a sea of legs all running in panic. Being small, that was my entire view, just chaos at knee level. The emotion was pure terror. I thought my parents had lost me, though years later they told me they never lost sight of me. The confusion, the screaming, and the feeling of being alone are burned into my memory. The other image is a towering column of thick, black smoke that looked from my angle like it was rising straight from the control tower. The emotion then was confusion, wondering why the tall building was burning. Years later, my mother told me it had been the 1972 Sacramento accident. She said our family had planned to go to Farrell's ice cream parlor, but my dad, who had been a Navy pilot in World War II, wanted to stay a little longer to watch the F-86 take off. She remembered him shouting, "Cut it off, stop," as he saw the plane struggling to gain speed. The jet barely lifted off the runway, crossed the road at the end, then lost lift and crashed straight into Farrell's. The pilot somehow survived, but many people on the ground didn't. I didn't understand it at the time, but that day left a permanent mark on everyone who was there. Story 10. I have a couple of stories. The first and worst one happened when I was driving to my terrible job at a shoe store. I had zoned out on the highway when I suddenly caught sight of a car swerving violently. One moment it was fine, the next it rolled 4 or 5 times off the side of the road. I pulled over, called 911, and ran to help. The driver had been thrown from the car and was lying on the ground with multiple severe injuries. He wasn't breathing, and I couldn't find a pulse. I started chest compressions until emergency services arrived a few minutes later. They took over, but couldn't revive him. When they took the body away and I gave my statement to the police, I got back in my car and drove to work in shock. It hit me later that I had performed CPR on a corpse of bloody, broken, unrecognizable body, and that image has stayed with me ever since. The second story happened when I lived in Mexico City. I attended a religious school there for a few months to learn Spanish. One day it rained so hard that the streets turned into rivers and water seeped into the buildings, covering the linoleum floors. The floors were slick and everyone was sliding around and laughing. Someone shouted, "Do a full spin!" And one of my friends, who always did wild stuff, took off running, tried to slide, and spun halfway before his feet flew out from under him. He hit the floor face first so hard that 4 of his teeth shattered instantly and scattered across the floor, while several others chipped. Blood poured from his mouth and nose, covering nearly 10 feet of the hallway. I grabbed paper towels and pressed them to his face as someone else tried to clean the spreading blood. He ended up with a badly broken nose, 4 missing teeth, and 3 or 4 chipped ones. Somehow he took it like a champ, but that horrific moment is burned into my mind forever. Story 11. I was in the back seat of a Volkswagen Jetta on the freeway, going about 80 miles per hour with 2 other people. A friend of a friend was driving, speeding to catch up with some kind of supercar ahead of us. Suddenly, the hood popped open, completely shattering the front windshield and caving in the metal roof about 4 inches from the top of the glass. The under-roof plastic tore off and flew down the highway, while the hood stayed upright, blocking all vision. We were still going 80, blind, and somehow he leaned out the window and managed to steer us safely to the shoulder. A police officer who had been right behind us pulled over, but instead of ticketing him for speeding or the expired license, he just said, "I'm impressed with how you handled that," and called a tow truck. Turns out the driver had fixed the hood latch using a clothes hanger, which broke when the wind pressure hit it. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. We were covered in glass, and even years later, whenever I'm in a car going fast, I still get flashbacks, like I'm waiting for the hood to fly up again. Story 12. I worked at a boat and jet ski rental business during the summer. The season was almost over, so things were slow, only 2 or 3 rentals a day. One afternoon, a group of Korean guys in their early 20s rented 3 jet skis for an hour. They were typical reckless renters, constantly needing to be reminded to slow down near the docks and stay apart from each other. During the last 10 minutes of their time, I was on my phone when I heard a loud crash and then silence. I looked up, yelled for my coworker to call our boss, and jumped on a spare jet ski to check. They had collided at full speed, completely tearing one of the jet skis in half. One guy's face was destroyed. No teeth left, his face swollen and covered in blood. 2 others were in the water nearby. I pulled the injured man onto my jet ski, yelling for my coworker to call 911. He had broken every bone in his face and lost all but 2 teeth. I was drenched in his blood. Another guy had broken his leg in 3 places and had a hole the size of a golf ball in his foot. We got them back to the dock where the paramedics took over, and then I spent the next 3 hours hauling wreckage from the water and scrubbing away blood. Story 13. I was sitting in a standstill traffic jam in the middle of some road construction, engine off, windows open, just accepting that I'd be stuck for a while. People had even gotten out of their cars to chat. Suddenly, I heard sirens approaching. I started my engine and pulled as close to the edge as possible so emergency vehicles could get through, assuming there had been a crash up ahead. A few seconds later, about 10 cars behind me, a car suddenly shot out from between the lanes, and 3 police cars appeared in pursuit. The driver stopped for a moment, then floored it right down the middle between all the parked cars, ripping off wing mirrors as he flew past. There was nothing anyone could do. I just braced for impact. Luckily, because I had already pulled in tight, he missed me and instead clipped a van before speeding down the queue. No one was hurt, just a few damaged vehicles, but it took a long time for my heart to slow down. I never did find out what that chase was about, but later I saw pictures of the aftermath online. Traffic started moving again once the police went after him and cleared the way. Story 14. In 1979, I was walking home with some friends when we passed by an elderly care home and saw one of the small apartments engulfed in flames. Fire poured from the windows. We ran over, smashed the glass door, and a dog and a cat bolted out. I stayed low and crawled inside, shouting for anyone still there. Through the thick smoke, I heard a faint voice calling for help. The kitchen was completely on fire, the heat unbearable, flames crawling across the counters. On the floor was a large woman, her arm raised, her clothes burning. She tried to reach out to me, but I couldn't get close, the heat was too intense. My friends who had followed me in dragged me back out. For years, I couldn't get that moment out of my head. We grabbed a garden hose and tried to fight the fire until the firefighters arrived. When they did, they put it out, then sat silently with us for what felt like hours, arms across our shoulders, saying nothing. The silence said everything. We were numb. Later, the council tried to give us awards, but we all refused. We just wanted to forget. Looking back, I realize how much respect I have for those firefighters. They deal with scenes like that all the time, yet still took a moment to comfort a few terrified kids. To any firefighter reading this, thank you. You don't hear it enough. Story 15. I was in the parking lot of a community college when I parked my car and suddenly heard furious shouting, multiple people yelling angrily. I followed the noise and saw a Polynesian man screaming at 3 big, rough-looking guys who were walking toward their large white pickup truck with a Confederate flag on the back. The man was about 20 yards away, still yelling at them, when all 3 calmly reached into the bed of the truck, pulled out chainsaws, started them, and began revving them. Then, like something out of a Robert Rodriguez movie, they scraped the chainsaws along the asphalt as they walked in a straight line toward him. The Polynesian guy couldn't have been taller than 5'8" and wasn't particularly large, but what he did next was incredible. He tore off his shirt, revealing intricate Polynesian blackwork tattoos, and began performing what I can only assume was the haka alone. staring down these three men revving chainsaws at him. It was one of the most intense and awe-inspiring things I've ever witnessed. For a moment, I thought I was about to see a brutal hate crime unfold. But after about 30 seconds, the three men lost their nerve. They stopped, turned around, got back into their truck, and drove off. Clearly, they weren't ready to kill someone over an argument. That Polynesian man, though, stood there like the toughest person I've ever seen in my life. Story 16. When I was about 8 years old, I was standing by the living room window in our house in South Florida, watching a breathtaking sunset full of yellows, oranges, and purples. That window looked out onto the main road in front of our house. Suddenly, I saw what looked like a white trash bag flying about 10 feet into the air. But when I focused, I realized it was a woman being thrown from her bicycle. I screamed for help, and my mother, who was a registered nurse, and my aunt ran outside. I was frozen in the doorway as my aunt shouted back at me to call 911. I couldn't move. I just stood there. Later, I learned the woman hit by the car was my gym teacher. She'd been riding her bike with headphones on when an elderly woman, driving on the back road because of brake problems, hit her. My teacher's son was in my class, and the loss devastated him. I never told him I had witnessed the accident. He struggled for years, but eventually turned out successful. I still can't imagine what his childhood was like after that. About 5 years later, I was walking down a campground road with my dad, who managed the place. We were heading to check out a bathroom that had some issues. Around 300 feet away ran the main road parallel to our path. Suddenly, I saw a truck speeding by with a group of kids riding in an inflatable boat tied to its bed. The truck was also towing a real boat behind it. The kids were laughing and yelling, clearly having fun. Then, in an instant, the wind caught under the inflatable boat, lifting it into the air and launching the kids out onto the highway. Some flew over the real boat, while others were struck by it as it rolled forward. My dad immediately pulled me away and wouldn't let me go near the scene. I never found out what happened to those kids, but I still remember that moment vividly, the sound of their laughter just before everything went wrong. It's been almost 20 years, and I can still picture it like it happened yesterday. Story 17, I went fishing less than a month ago and spent the whole morning out on the water. Around midday, 3 big speedboats flew by on the river, full throttle, clearly out for fun. We decided to follow them because, honestly, who doesn't love watching boats like that tear across the water? Not long after, the lead boat suddenly lost control while the other 2 powered down and stopped. The first boat spun out and threw everyone into the river. No life jackets, no safety lanyards, nothing. When we got closer, another man on a pontoon had already arrived and was trying to help the people in the water, but the driverless speedboat was circling them at full speed. That man on the pontoon had been struck by the propeller and lost his leg. My friend pulled him out of the water and rushed him to shore, where paramedics got him into an ambulance and managed to save his life. The driver of the speedboat survived, but his father, who was riding with him, was missing. We searched for hours using side-imaging fish finders, combing every section of the river. Watching that son standing on the boat, screaming and crying for his dad, was something I'll never forget. They found his father's body later that evening after dive teams arrived. The son had bought the boat only 3 days earlier. A mechanical failure caused the accident. But what still haunts me is how easily it could have been avoided. Life jackets, kill switches, basic precautions. I haven't set foot on a boat since that day. Please, if you go out on the water, wear your life jackets. They might not look cool, but they can save your life. Story 18. It was May 3rd, 1999. I was in 7th grade heading home after a great day at school. I couldn't wait to relax, watch cartoons, and play Pokemon. When I got home, I started some laundry, grabbed snacks for me and my little brother, and turned on the TV. A weather alert interrupted the show, and a bad storm near Anadarko, and our county was under a tornado watch. I kept an eye on the radar while finishing chores. I decided to read a book instead of playing my Game Boy, and told my brother to keep the TV on so we could watch the updates. Soon it was clear this wasn't an ordinary storm. Multiple tornadoes had been spotted, one near Chickasha. The sky was darkening, but the radar looked like it might miss us, at least for now. My mom, who lived across the state, called several times. worried as usual about storms. My dad, who we lived with, hadn't made it home yet, and my sister was with him. Then the weather reporter said a tornado had been sighted near Amber, the next town over, about 15 miles away, and it was massive. I packed a bag with clothes, grabbed a pry bar just in case we needed to brace the storm cellar door, and waited. The sky turned green, the wind howled, and hail started pounding the ground. My little brother was crying about our cat, and we tried to find it, but when the countdown hit 100, we gave up. Just then, our elderly neighbor arrived and insisted we come to his cellar. It was bigger, dry, and had a radio. His whole family was already there. We piled into his truck and drove as fast as we could. Before climbing down into the shelter, I turned to look back. The tornado filled the entire horizon. It was a sight I'll never forget, massive, dark, roaring. Inside the cellar, 12 of us huddled together while the wind screamed like a train. The walls shook, debris slammed into the door, and it felt like forever before it stopped. Then it started again, the second wave, even worse than the first. When silence finally came, we waited 10 minutes before opening the door. Everything was gone. Houses, cars, entire neighborhoods, all flattened or stripped to bare foundations. The world looked green and unreal. My brother wanted to run home, but he was barefoot, so I told him to stay while I checked on Dad and my sister. I jogged through the wreckage, guided only by memory. Our house was half standing. A line of bushes had caught flying cattle, forming a barrier that spared one side of the house. The barn was gone, cars crushed, debris everywhere. A fallen tree covered our storm cellar, and rescue crews were cutting it away when I arrived. Then I saw them, my dad and sister, alive, climbing out of the cellar. Minutes later, a four-wheeler brought my brother to us. We salvaged what little we could, Dad's gemstones, a few valuables, and caught a ride into town to stay with a friend. I turned 12 just weeks before that day, but it's a memory that still feels raw, like it happened yesterday. Story 19. I was driving home after taking my aunt to work when several other cars and I stopped at a light where a double set of train tracks divides the traffic. There was space for one car before the tracks, and I was sitting behind the first two cars in line. One car was stopped at the stop bar and a truck was immediately behind it, sitting on the tracks. I was stopped at the stop bar on the far side of the tracks where that truck should have been. All of a sudden, the crossing arms began to lower and you could hear the train coming. I thought, oh, that truck is going to get crushed. I laid on my horn, threw my car in reverse, and slammed the gas. The truck did the same and backed out of the crossing seconds before the train went through. I was really grateful there wasn't anyone behind me. The crossing arm landed on top of the truck and stayed on its hood as the train passed. I parked to check on the truck driver. He was bawling, a big, tough-looking man crying his eyes out. He got out and hugged me, thanking me. It turned out he hadn't noticed the crossing arms lowering until I blasted my horn. After the train passed, I followed him to a nearby gas station and bought him a cookie and some soda. He was pretty shaken, and so was I. Story 20, I was working my regular job as a bank teller when two men in ski masks came in. One jumped over the teller line into the drive-thru area, and the other jumped onto the teller line and began marching up and down shouting orders. Every single employee except me and one other girl hid. I stood frozen until he fired 2 shots at me. He missed. I began collecting as much cash as I could and stuffing it into his pack. Then he told me to get more from the other girl's drawer. As I headed there, I saw one employee trying to crawl to the phone like some kind of hero. I had to fight the urge to kick her because if he saw her, she would get shot. I handed him more money and then they ran. Police arrived quickly because the people hiding under desks hit the emergency button. We had to coax terrified co-workers out of the bathrooms. The FBI got involved. The robbers were caught a few months later and their trials dragged on for over a year. While I froze, I literally felt like I was about to urinate, but I didn't. I still wonder if I should have hidden too, or if that would have been worse because then no one would have been handing them cash. The other non-hider was shaking so badly he could barely move, almost like a palsy. Story 21. It was a totally normal day going to school with my twin sister. We were 13 and arguing like usual. Then we stopped to buy sodas and went a different way than we usually did. I noticed it but didn't think much of it and kept walking with my sister. We crossed the street to wait at the crossroads when a large van pulled up on our left and blocked our view, sitting there waiting to drive. The driver was making strange hand signals, and because we were waiting a while, I asked my sister if she thought he was signaling for us to cross. Being wild, she said probably, and darted out across the road. In that moment, I stood frozen thinking, one day she is going to get hurt if she keeps being so hot-headed. Then she was airborne like a rag doll, launched across the street, and I could only watch as she rolled and tried to sit up with blood pouring from her nose. Luckily, a police officer who was only a street away saw it and rushed over. She was taken to the hospital. She lived. She had a broken rib and a swollen leg, but nothing worse. Very lucky. But I still get dizzy in cars and will never forget the sickening thought that I should have stopped her. I should have. Story 22. When I was 17 or 18, around 1990 or 1991, I worked for a pharmacy that made deliveries. One evening on my way back from my last stop, I saw a vehicle suddenly engulfed in flames near a small hospital, just a few buildings down from the store. It was an older Bronco, parked by the sidewalk near the entrance. The back window faced the street, and as I watched, I saw something bob up and down quickly inside the vehicle. I pulled into the pharmacy parking lot, ran inside, and called 911. Later, I learned what had happened. A man had drenched the vehicle in gasoline and told someone to go get his wife. When she came outside, he lit himself in the car on fire. The movement I saw in the back seat was even worse than I could have imagined. His children, who had also been doused with gasoline, trapped and burning inside while their mother screamed helplessly. That image haunted me for years. I kept asking myself, what if I had arrived just a few seconds earlier? Could I have saved them? But now that I'm older, I know those poor babies couldn't have been saved. Still, that scene never left me. Story 23. Around 2005, when I was 11 years old, I was playing Super Monkey Ball on a GameCube at my best friend's house. It was a normal morning after a sleepover. Suddenly, we heard her 14-year-old sister running down the stairs, followed by a loud crash and shattering glass. We rushed to see what happened and found her standing at the front door, her arms raised, the skin on the underside of both upper arms hanging in strips. Blood was pouring out, pooling around her feet. We grabbed dish towels and wrapped her arms while she was rushed to the hospital. All of us kids between 9 and 14 years old were left behind in the house surrounded by blood trails and broken glass. I remember how terrified my best friend was, afraid her sister wouldn't make it. Even now, after working as a phlebotomist, I've never seen so much blood in my life. We had no cell phones back then, so we waited by the landline for hours with no word. When their mom came home, she had no idea what had happened and screamed when she saw the mess puddles of blood everywhere and the shattered door. I was too young to process my emotions, but I'll never forget my best friend's terrified face. Thankfully, her sister survived after a blood transfusion and countless stitches or staples. She was left with long scars along her upper arms. Back then, kids wore colorful plastic bracelets stacked on their wrists, and she had several on when she fell. The emergency room doctor told her those bracelets likely saved her life by keeping the glass from cutting deeper and severing her wrists. Years later, she got a one-up tattoo near the worst scar to remind her that she was given a second chance. Story 24. I was in calculus class on the second floor of my school, near the main entrance. It was a normal day, and I sat near the back by the window facing the front area. In the middle of class, we heard a quick, sharp pop, not quite like a soda can, but strange enough that some of us went to the window to look. What we saw made our blood run cold. A man had been shot in the head near the entrance stairwell, and blood was slowly pooling around him. Someone nearby ran to try and help him. I live in Canada. This kind of thing just doesn't happen. Panic set in immediately. We looked at each other in shock, wondering if the shooter was still out there or if there were more. Screams echoed through the hallways. We barricaded the classroom door with desks and chairs, praying for help. During the chaos, I managed to call my mom and text my brother before the phone lines overloaded and lost reception. I sat there crying, convinced the shooter would find us next. Then there was a pounding at the door and a man shouting that he was with the SWAT team. We froze until one student cautiously opened it. They rushed us out to safety. The man who was shot in the head miraculously survived, but another person inside the school didn't make it. It turned out to be a lone shooter. That day changed everything for me. The sound of that single pop still echoes in my memory. Story 25. It wasn't really during the day, but late at night. Some background first. My best friend moved to Canada about 3 or 4 years ago, while the rest of us still live in the Netherlands. The good thing is that he visits every holiday and always stays with my family when he's here, since he's close with my parents, which isn't easy because they're from Iran and not easily impressed. During one summer holiday, we had just come back from hanging out with friends around 11 at night. Back then, the show Vikings had just finished its second season, so we decided to binge watch both seasons. My friend, however, is the kind of person who absolutely can't function without at least 8 hours of sleep, so he went to bed early. For context, our house had 3 floors, and the top one was genuinely creepy. Whenever relatives stayed over, my little brother and I always felt bad for whoever got stuck sleeping up there. It looked straight out of a Stephen King movie. Since my room didn't have enough space for a mattress, my poor best friend had to sleep on the 3rd floor. We teased him relentlessly about it. Every morning, my parents would jokingly ask if he'd heard the ghosts, or I'd say things like, "Sleep well, hope we see you in the morning." At first, he hated the jokes, but after a while, he learned to laugh them off. That changed after the night, as we still call it. That evening, he went upstairs around 11, and I stayed downstairs finishing a few episodes. Finally, around 2 in the morning, I went to bed. I had just fallen asleep when a bright flashlight suddenly hit me right in the eyes. Half asleep, I thought I was being kidnapped, until I realized it was my friend. I told him to go away, thinking he was playing a prank, but he kept insisting I wake up. Still half asleep and confused, I caught fragments of what he was saying. Something about laughing, not being able to sleep, and being scared. I figured he'd had a nightmare, so I agreed to go upstairs and sleep beside his bed on a blanket, just to calm him down. He explained that every 30 minutes, he'd been hearing a terrifying laugh. I brushed it off, said a few prayers, and went back to sleep. 10 minutes later, he woke me again, shaking me hard. Annoyed, I was about to yell at him when I heard it too, the laugh. It was the most chilling, inhuman sound I'd ever heard in my life, like something straight out of a horror movie. My body froze completely. The sound came from above us, but we were already on the top floor of the house. Every 30 minutes it returned, the same eerie laugh echoing through the ceiling. We were paralyzed with fear, too terrified to move or call for my parents. My voice barely worked. I could only whisper. I started praying quietly, convinced we were about to be possessed by something evil. Somehow we both drifted off eventually, but I still don't know how. To this day, we have no idea where that laugh came from. I never set foot on the 3rd floor again after that night, and neither did he. My parents thought we were exaggerating, but I know what I heard. That laugh was real, and it was the most horrifying sound I've ever experienced. True story. Story 26. I was at Whole Foods with my mother, shopping near the deli counter, as she looked for a specific type of ham she liked. While she was placing her order, I noticed a woman next to us start twitching uncontrollably and tap my mom on the shoulder. The moment she saw it, she knew the woman was having a seizure. One of our cats had seizures, and although he never twitched beforehand, my mother had done research on both feline and human seizures out of curiosity. Within seconds, the woman collapsed and went into a full grand mal seizure right there on the floor. Several employees rushed out from behind the counter to help her, and a few bystanders knelt down to hold her head so she wouldn't hit the hard tile. My mom wanted to help but couldn't get down easily because of injuries from a car accident. And since help came quickly, I just stood ready in case they needed something. Paramedics arrived shortly after, and while I didn't see the rest, we were told she was taken away on a stretcher to the local hospital. We never found out what happened to her afterward. It was one of 2 wild things I've ever seen at a Whole Foods in my life. Story 27. I was 18, living in a small 2nd-floor apartment on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. It was the middle of winter, maybe 3 or 4 degrees at night. I had come home from school, made dinner, and crashed hard like I'd run a marathon. My younger brother, who was 16, was staying at his girlfriend's place, so I was alone. Around 8 that evening, I woke up briefly, opened the balcony door for no reason, then went to bed, opening my bedroom window before closing the door behind me. I didn't think anything of it. A few hours later, I woke to the sound of the fire brigade smashing through my front door. They were in full oxygen gear, yelling my name and dragging me out of bed. I couldn't even see across the hallway. It was full of smoke. I thought someone else's apartment was on fire until I got to the door and realized it was mine. They worked for about 30 minutes to clear the smoke from the unit. Everything inside was destroyed. Outside, the paramedics tried to put me on a stretcher, but I told them I was fine. They checked my vitals and were shocked I was even alive. Later, the police and fire investigators arrived and asked questions. The next day, CSI came and confirmed what had happened. Someone had firebombed my front door the only way out. It was ruled an attempted murder. They said the burning plastic carpet and heavy smoke should have killed me, but the open doors and window created just enough airflow to buy me time. It was surreal. I shouldn't have survived, but somehow I did. Story 28. I was skiing with a group of friends when I suggested we hit the terrain park. I made sure everyone was comfortable doing jumps, and everyone claimed they were. The first feature was a massive ramp with a tabletop. If you hit it right, you'd glide about a foot above the snow for nearly 200 feet. The first skier went, cleared it perfectly. The second cleared it too, but barely clipped the edge with the back of his ski. Then the third guy went. He tried to bail about 10 yards before the ramp, but he was going too fast to stop and ended up going off it too slowly and without enough lift. Mid-air, he tilted backward, his skis kicked up, and he slammed into the end of the tabletop square in the middle of his back. Snapped it instantly. He tumbled down the rest of the slope, unconscious, and came to a stop in the landing zone. We had to block off the trail because we couldn't move him. The only small mercy was that he'd been knocked out cold on impact and stayed that way until ski patrol arrived. Story 29. I was up late gaming one night around 3 in the morning and went upstairs to grab something to eat just in my underwear. On my way back downstairs, I thought I heard someone moving by the sliding glass door on the deck. I pulled the curtain back, expecting maybe my dad, and for a split second, I thought it was him. Then I turned on the porch light and froze. It wasn't my dad. It was some random man leaning against the door, bleeding from his head. My heart dropped. I sprinted upstairs, woke my dad, threw on some clothes, and ran back down. Turns out the guy had been drinking and crashed his motorcycle in our yard, completely missing the curve in the road and wiping out on the sidewalk. Thankfully, he wasn't aggressive, just dazed and hurt. My dad and I helped him inside, cleaned up his wounds, and found out where he lived so we could drive him home. We didn't call the cops. My dad didn't want trouble, and after watching some of my older siblings ruin their lives with bad decisions, he just wanted to do the right thing quietly. I'll never forget the terror I felt when I first saw that bleeding stranger at our door. I was 19, and I don't think I've ever felt fear like that before. Story 30. I was on the subway heading home from work when the train suddenly screeched to a halt. After a few minutes, there was a lot of commotion outside, flashlights, shouting, movement along the tracks, but no one knew what was happening. Then a police officer entered our car, moved everyone to one end, and went back out. A few moments later, we felt the train lift slightly, as if it were being jacked up. That's when we heard the screaming, high-pitched, raw, agonizing. The doors opened and paramedics rushed in, carrying a man covered in blood. They laid him on the floor right in front of us and started working to stabilize him. Apparently, he'd been on the tracks and got run over by the train, pinned underneath the very car I was in. They had to jack up the train to get him out. We were stuck inside with him for about 15 minutes as he alternated between moaning and screaming in pain while the paramedics worked. It was horrifying. Once they had him stable enough, they carried him out through the dark tunnel to the nearest exit. The power had been cut to the third rail for safety, so we sat there for a long time until they restored it. The train was packed, and there was nowhere for us to go, so an officer stood in front of the bloody spot on the floor until we finally started moving again. What was usually a 30-minute commute took 3 hours that day. When we reached the next station, everyone had to get off so they could take the train out of service and clean it. I'll never forget the sound of that man's screams, pure, unbearable pain. Story 31. A couple of years ago, I started my first job out of college as a leasing agent. About 3 weeks in, a young couple came in upset, saying they were subleasing from someone, but kept getting late rent notices. After some digging, we realized the woman they'd been paying had been pocketing their money instead of paying the rent. They confronted her, and minutes later, she stormed into the leasing office, screaming that the couple was lying. She ran across my desk, grabbing the phone to call her mom. She was only 18 and had tricked her mom into co-signing the lease. The couple and I told her we were calling the police. She backed toward the door, and I thought she was going to lock us in, but then she started screaming threats like, "I'm gonna mess all of you up," and other obscene things. I was terrified, 21 years old, and face to face with someone completely unhinged. She ran back to her apartment before the police arrived, but when they couldn't find her, she returned and started yelling again. She jumped on desks, shouting, "You think you got me? They ain't taking me to jail. You know why? 'Cause I'm crazy. They'll take me to the crazy house, and I'll be back out." Her eyes were wild and she was rocking a chair back and forth while laughing. Then an officer suddenly walked in and yelled at her to stop. Instantly, she started crying and claiming we'd been mean to her. She went from furious to pitiful in seconds. It was one of the scariest encounters I've ever had, and honestly, I was probably crazier for staying at that job after that. Story 32, I was in my freshman year of high school, and all day I had this gut feeling that something bad was going to happen. I couldn't shake it. Still, the day went great. I even got an A on a speech, which was a big deal since public speaking terrified me. When I got home, I grabbed a snack and decided to check if my dad was up. He was a contractor and sometimes came home early to nap. I peeked into his room and saw him asleep, so I thought nothing of it and went upstairs to play Super Nintendo Mario Bros. My sister came home about an hour later and sat next to me to watch. That uneasy feeling crept back, but I tried to ignore it. About half an hour later, my stepbrother's girlfriend came up and told me to come downstairs and told my sister to stay where she was. I handed my sister the controller and followed her down. She blocked the doorway to the living room crying. I asked what was wrong and she said my dad wasn't going to make it. I pushed past her and saw paramedics working over him. He had overdosed. I ran to him, begging him to wake up, but he was already cold and pale. They called the time of death. They had been working on him for a while. I just remember collapsing next to him, refusing to leave. She told me to go upstairs, tell my sister, and wait for the rest of the family. For years, I blamed myself. I checked on him earlier because I heard noises. He must have been overdosing right then. That was 19 years ago, but I remember it like it happened yesterday. Story 33. When I was 14, I was hanging out at a friend's house. We walked down to the candy store, and on our way back, we heard sirens. A crash had happened up the road we just walked. I texted my mom to come pick me up, but she didn't answer. We passed the crash on our way back. One truck's front end was completely destroyed, and a Mazda minivan was sideways and crushed. I saw a woman slumped in the driver's seat, blood everywhere, on her, the car interior, and even the pavement. Paramedics were trying to help her. It looked bad. We kept walking, but something gnawed at me. I kept texting my mom, no response. I tried calling too. Nothing. Then I remembered she'd borrowed my sister's car that day. When I got back to my friend's house, the realization hit me. The car in the accident was the same make and color as my sister's. My stomach dropped. I broke out in a cold sweat, feeling sick, replaying the image of the bloody woman, wondering if it was my mom. I didn't know what to do. How do you even tell your friend something like that? 15 agonizing minutes later, she finally called. She'd left her phone in the car while running into a store. I was furious, but mostly just relieved beyond words. Story 34. On December 21st, 2016, we were driving home from a Christmas light display at our local zoo. My wife was behind the wheel, our 1- and 2-year-olds strapped in the back seat, and I was in the passenger seat. It was around 9 at night, and we were cruising along the highway at about 60 miles per hour when my wife said, "What is that?" I looked up from my phone and saw what looked like a large black trash bag stuffed full, lying on its side in our lane. Before I could say a word, we hit it. There was a horrible thump, thump, scrape sound. My wife gasped, "Oh my God, I think that was a person." I told her to pull over and stay in the car. I didn't want her to see. I ran back toward the object and saw a pool of blood about 6 feet wide. Then I saw her, the woman, or what was left of her. I tried to help, called 911, and gave what medical assistance I could. Soon the scene filled with flashing lights and traffic was completely stopped. Another car had pulled over ahead of us, and people from nearby businesses gathered. Paramedics arrived quickly. The detective later explained what happened. The woman had tried to cross the highway at a crosswalk while traffic had a green light. The car in front of us hit her first, throwing her into our lane. A second later, we struck her again. She was already gone. The police ruled it an accident, and we weren't charged. But we had to stay at the scene for 4 hours. The body was under our car, and we had to shut it off to avoid, horribly enough, burning it onto the engine. We had our babies in the car, and it was December, freezing cold. My insurance ended up paying her family $10,000 as a settlement, though they tried to sue. The car was later deep cleaned, the bumper and exhaust replaced. Driving it again felt like driving a grave. The worst part was reading online comments afterward, people calling us drunk, careless, monsters. But no one was speeding and no one was texting. She had simply stepped into a live lane at night. I've seen a lot of trauma as a former paramedic and later a soldier, but that night, the sound, the blood, the shock will stay with me forever. Story 35. When I was 14, my family took a road trip across Pennsylvania to visit my grandmother. I hadn't slept much the night before, so I passed out almost instantly in the car, which was unusual for me. Then I woke to the loudest bang I'd ever heard, like an explosion on the roof. My heart skipped beats, and I shot upright, completely disoriented. My little sister was beside me, screaming and flailing, tears pouring down her face, which made my panic even worse. I turned to see what she was looking at, and all I saw through the back window was an enormous cloud of smoke rising into the sky. Still half asleep, I asked what was happening. She told me a double-trailer FedEx truck behind us hadn't noticed traffic had stopped and had plowed over a car right next to us. My dad jumped out of the car to see if he could help, but the wreck suddenly burst into flames. I remember seeing him sprint back toward us, banging on the car roof and yelling at everyone to move. We were frozen in shock. I turned to my older sister sitting beside me, and we both involuntarily smiled at each other out of pure disbelief. A strange, terrified reaction that haunted me for years. As traffic started moving again, my dad jumped in and drove away. I screamed, "Wait! Aren't we going to help them?" He looked at me in the rearview mirror and said quietly, "I'm sure they died instantly. They're probably in a better place than we are right now." We sat there watching the wreck burn as we crept past, convinced the car would explode and kill us all. Later, I learned that inside the crushed vehicle were a mother, a grandmother, and a daughter, all killed instantly. The truck driver, a woman, had jumped out and survived. I still think about that moment, the fire, my sister's screams, and the awful involuntary smile that made me feel guilty for years. Story 36. Back in 2005, I had just dropped off my girlfriend and was heading to work. I stopped at a T intersection, waiting to turn right. I looked right, then left, then right again, just in time to see a guy on a motorcycle flying down the road at insane speed, easily over 100 miles per hour, passing another car over a double yellow line. Before I could even react, he slammed headfirst into a huge truck not 2 feet in front of my car. The sound was deafening, the motorcycle engine screaming, the sudden silence when it stopped, the truck's tires screeching, metal crunching. It all hit at once. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The rider was just gone. What was left of him scattered across the pavement like something out of a low-budget horror movie. Parts of him wrapped into the truck's front grille and radiator. He'd hit so hard that the radiator bent into an L shape over the engine block. For anyone who doesn't know, cars meet shouldn't be able to do that. I jumped out of my car to help, or at least I thought I would. I was 18, working at a pizza place, completely unprepared for what I saw. While calling 911, I knelt next to the motorcyclist, who was still barely alive, making this wet, breathy sound, like he was trying to scream but couldn't. His front half was practically gone, and his eyes went blank within seconds. I remember thinking numbly, well, that's someone my age who just died right in front of me. I went to check on the truck driver next. She was screaming uncontrollably, blood-curdling cries that drowned everything else out while I was still on the phone with dispatchers trying to ask me questions I couldn't even process. Eventually, the cops and paramedics arrived, took statements, and let me go. I made it to work late and got written up for it, dealt with rude customers all night. Then on the drive home, the drive shaft on my car fell out. When I finally walked into my room, I discovered someone had broken in and stolen my stuff. That day was a full-blown nightmare from start to finish. Story 37. A few years ago, we were having an addition built onto our house. That day it was just one construction worker on site, while my older brother, about 19, and I were home alone. It was a slow, quiet day until we heard the most horrifying scream from outside. I ran to the side door and saw the worker standing there, blood pouring all over the porch. He had been cutting wood with a table saw in the garage and had sliced off his pinky finger and mangled his ring finger. My brother grabbed his car keys while I ran for a towel. We wrapped his hand as best we could, and my brother rushed to drive him to the hospital. Just before they pulled out of the driveway, the guy yelled for his phone so he could call his wife. I ran back inside but realized I didn't know where it was. So I darted back out, got directions from him, found it, and handed it over before they sped off. I started hosing down the blood from the porch when my brother called, panicked. The hospital didn't have the ring finger, and they needed it immediately if they were going to try reattaching it. My stomach dropped. The thought of having to find a severed finger made me nauseous, but I went to the garage and started searching. There was blood sprayed across the floor and even on the ceiling, so I figured the finger might have been flung somewhere. I began digging through everything, and soon my mom, brother, and our neighbors showed up to help. We had cleared half the garage and spent what felt like forever looking, terrified it was too late for the surgery anyway. Then the phone rang. The hospital called to say they'd had the finger the whole time. It had fallen off into the towel we used to wrap his hand, and no one had realized. They managed to reattach it successfully. Everything turned out fine in the end. Just a week later, the guy's wife gave birth to their baby, and a few months after the house was finished, we threw a big party for the crew. The worker, now nicknamed Finger Man, came with his family, thanked my brother and me over and over, and I made them a cheesecake to celebrate. Story 38. One of my older friends had a rough life. When he was 16, he won $10,000 on a scratch card, and instead of being a lucky break, it sent him spiraling into substance use. My parents always warned me to stay away from him, believing he was the reason my older brother got into trouble and ended up in prison. Years later, when he was around 27, he invited me out for a few drinks. I've always been a fixer type, so I figured maybe I could help him somehow. After a few pints, he said he was picking up some MDMA and pressured me into trying it. I took half a pill, my first time ever, and just as it started to hit, he said, "Watch this." Then he ran straight into the street and jumped in front of an oncoming car. It happened so fast. The impact was brutal. His head smashed through the windshield, and he flipped upside down before being thrown about 30 feet when the car screeched to a stop. I was frozen, high, confused, and watching my friend's body crumple on the road. His face was covered in blood, his nose and teeth broken, and he was making this awful gurgling, snoring sound. I snapped into action, called for an ambulance, and pressed my hands against his wounds while blood soaked my clothes. The air ambulance arrived quickly and took him to the hospital. Later I learned that he had told his mom earlier that day that he planned to end his life. She showed up at the scene completely distraught while I stood there, still high, shaking, and covered in blood, guilt eating me alive for not realizing what he'd meant when he said he was done. I ended up writing a poem about that day for a university creative writing course. Even now, years later, I can still feel the chaos of that moment. The good news is that he survived. He still struggles with coca addiction, but his mindset and determination to live are something I truly admire. Story 39. My family used to have a place on the Colorado River, a spot where people would drink and hang out above the boat dock, watching others come and go. One afternoon after we'd spent some time boating, we had just finished loading up and were getting ready to leave when we heard a jet ski engine rev to full throttle, a sharp scream, and then a deafening crash. A man had been preparing to take his 9-year-old daughter out on the river for her first ride. He had just parked the car after backing their jet ski into the water, leaving her waiting on it while he walked back. Somehow she accidentally twisted the throttle and shot forward at full speed, straight into the concrete side of the boat ramp. The impact was brutal. She flew several feet through the air and hit the wall face first. She had braces, and the collision tore her entire top and bottom lips apart. Most of her teeth had already fallen out by the time we reached her. My sister, who was a nurse, immediately ran over to help, but the rest of us, along with the drunk onlookers above, were frozen in horror for a few moments.